Hey everybody, my name is Adam Duckworth and I am so thrilled to be with you all here today for this volunteer webinar series. And so before we dive in, this is a little bit of an unusual background for me because normally I do these type of interactive things in a studio or maybe at an organization on a stage, but because we are still kind of in the middle of somewhat of a quarantine, I am coming to you from my home office, which is highly related to Disney paraphernalia and things. So with all of the things in the background, I apologize for the distractions. If you want to focus on what all those things are behind me, you probably have a good time. You can pause this and check it out. But I love volunteering, and I've leaned into volunteers kind of my entire adult career, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today on this webinar. We're going to chat for about 20-25 minutes talking about the idea of helping volunteers succeed. And I love this topic because it's something that I've been really thinking about and marinating on for a long time and trying to put pen to paper on. I got a chance a number of years ago to begin writing about volunteering. So I've written 3 books on volunteering throughout my time in ministry and in the church world and in the nonprofit world. And I've had a good time doing this. And so I just love talking about this idea of volunteers and what they look like and who they are and how they give back. And I love volunteers because, number one, I started as a volunteer in my local church. It's been about 20 years now, hard to believe that it was that long ago, but I started out as a kindergarten and first grade boys small group leader and got a chance to lean into them and have some conversations, and it was so eye-opening to me, but it allowed me to kind of plug into the local church in a different and a unique way. And I love volunteers because volunteers, for whatever, have figured out that they have said yes to give themselves to a cause bigger than themselves for free. And what does that look like? How do they do that? How would they do that? And furthermore, how could we as leaders help volunteers succeed? And how could we help them do what they do even better? How could we help them understand their roles in a different way? How could we help them serve more? How could we get monthly volunteers to convert to weekly volunteers and give back even more than they do? That's a question that, man, is such an interesting and great question. And I just hope not that we have all the answers in this webinar here today, not that we figure out everything in this webinar here today, but one of the things that I hope that we get to do together is I just hope we get to have a little bit of a conversation. And I believe that we will do that. And I believe that we'll talk about some of the interesting things about volunteering versus some of the things that hopefully we hear about volunteering. So anyway, without further ado, let me just make a couple of points, right? So I just believe that for our volunteers, if we want them to succeed and we want them to do better, then we as leaders have a responsibility to lead them in a direction. I kind of just say over and over again that volunteers aren't necessarily going to lead themselves. It's not going to happen. And so one of the things that I just want to kind of bring up in front of everybody here is that volunteering for our volunteers is draining. I don't know if you know this, but volunteering is draining. You got to think about these people, right? They have lives and spouses and kids and jobs and activities and sporting events and all the things that goes into life in 2020 and beyond. We just have to understand that when you sign up to give yourself to a cause bigger than yourself for free, that volunteering is really a draining thing. It's one of those things that we just have to kind of all agree on and set the playing field. And furthermore, we heard from volunteers, so we asked them a question, right? Hey, volunteers, what are some things that you don't hear every week? As we talk about helping them succeed, we talk about some things that they hear back and forth. We just said oftentimes, you know what they didn't hear? You made such a difference in my life this week. Now, we kind of expect that, right, from preschoolers and elementary age kids. We really don't expect them to walk into their volunteers, hands, or even students. We don't expect them to put their hand in the hand of their volunteers and say, thank you so much. You've really helped me take different steps and different paths forward in the direction of my life this week. And we're not going to hear that from a 4-year-old. Here's another thing that we just said that volunteers didn't necessarily hear a lot. The story you help tell will stick with these kids forever. Right? It's not something that they hear a lot. Let me talk to you then about some things that volunteers said that they heard quite a bit. And so here's some things that, and these might blow your mind or they may not blow your mind, but if we're talking about just helping volunteers succeed, we want to start with our language and how we talk with volunteers. Here's some of the things that volunteers told us when we were compiling some data and interviews and all those things that they heard consistently. One of the things we heard them say consistently is, we are short-staffed. Interesting. So volunteers would show up to give themselves to a cause bigger than themselves for free, and sometimes their leaders would consistently tell them that they're short-staffed. Interesting. Here's one for you. No, sorry, that's the third one. I'm looking at my notes here on the screen. Here's the second one. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you signed up to volunteer. I'm glad that you're engaging with us, but we really need you to show up on time. Have you ever heard that one? And the third one that I was going to mention a couple of seconds ago was one of the things we heard volunteers say to us that they're told pretty often is, well, maybe we'd succeed more. Maybe if you worked a little harder. Okay, that's not one that they heard consistently. That was a little joke. But they do hear consistently, we're short-staffed. We need you to show up on time. We need you to read your curriculum in advance. We're really low in, our staffing in terms of our room, right? But one of the things that we said is that we want to help volunteers succeed. And this kind of all comes back to language, and this comes kind of all back to us leading them in a different direction. We just were reminded that as leaders, one of the biggest things that we can do related to volunteers is to understand the idea that volunteers need encouragement and volunteers need reminders, okay? So volunteers need encouragement and volunteers need reminders. And they need a whole bunch of other things as it goes into there. They need, and we could get specific with these things. They need encouragement about each week when they serve. They need encouragement about what they've done. They need encouragement when they have a bad week. They need reminders about so many things, not just the mundane tasks that go into volunteering, but things that they need to be reminded about: vision, why they're there, how great the organization's doing, how great the ministry's doing, right? And so one of the things that we just said is we started to ask ourselves a question. Okay, reminders about what? Okay, specifically, if we were going to ask ourselves, reminders about what? So we just said if we want volunteers to succeed, that volunteers need to be reminded about a couple of things. Number one, we just think that volunteers need to be reminded why they are there in the first place, right? Why they're there in the first place. And this kind of hits a lot of people when I say it square between the eyes, because what they realize, this is so key, don't miss this. What they realize is that there is definitely a contrast in the way that they're leading, because they're leading based on administration and they're not leading with vision. Did you hear what I said? They're leading with administration and they're not leading with vision. So therefore, all of the things that they're doing is they are trying to fill holes in their rooms. They're trying to make sure they have enough staff. They're trying to make sure the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. And by the way, those are good things. We should be doing those. But we're not leading with those things. We're leading with administration and we're not leading with vision. So if we want volunteers to succeed, we should ask ourselves this question: what are we reminding them of? They need encouragement, they need reminders. What are we reminding them of? So the question is this: how often do you go back to casting vision? How often do you go back to casting vision? If you've been in leadership circles for any length of time, you've probably heard this analogy that vision is like a big bucket with holes in the bottom, and you dump water in the bucket and the water just keeps pouring out. And what do you have to do as a leader? Keep filling that bucket back up. You should be casting vision consistently. It should be every event, every weekend, every conversation. The why behind what they do should be as important as what they do. How often do you go back to casting vision? Because if we want volunteers to succeed and we focus on those two things, encouragement and reminders, then we've got to go back to go, okay, how often are we reminding them about the why behind what they do? The other question is related to casting vision is not just do you cast it because you should be. You should be asking yourself, do I have a plan, or how often should I be casting vision from a large scale net? Right? Is it something that volunteers can kind of grasp onto and put their hands around it, right? Is vision something that is tangible, that they can see? And when you, don't miss this, when you achieve the vision with your volunteers, when someone comes to Christ, when a small group wins, when a story works, whatever that looks like in your space, do you ever go back and celebrate the vision that is actually won? So if we're going to remind volunteers and help them succeed, we're going to first of all remind them of why they're there in the first place. The second thing we're going to remind them of is this. It's what they're doing is making a difference, right? Is what they're doing is making a difference. One of the things that when I had the absolute privilege, one of the privileges of my life to write Not Normal, 7 Quirks of Incredible Volunteers with Sue Miller, that we actually sat back and said something, and we really wanted to put this in the book, so we put it in chapter 7, our final kind of closing chapter, because we kind of wanted to go out with this battle cry, this big thing with volunteers. And one of the things that we said, and it really just hit us, was that a lot of volunteers walk away thinking that what they did that week or that month or that hour or whatever it is, that it just really didn't matter. And so we started to ask ourselves the question about how can we help communicate to volunteers that not only what they're doing matters, but what they're doing is making a difference. So we kind of coined this phrase. And we coined this phrase and we called it, "You can't always see it." It was the idea that when you showed up every single week, specifically to work with kids or teenagers, or maybe at any position inside of the local church, that the results were not immediate. And that's hard, right? Because one of the things that we just said over and over again is that we are in a society where we want results quick. Boom, messages come through. Boom, texts come through. Facebook messages come through. Emails come through. We get immediate things and it happens. We order something on Amazon and boom, it's here. Maybe within a day, maybe within hours, depending on where you live. And so one of the things that we told church leaders over the course of time in Not Normal, 7 Quirks of Incredible Volunteers, was just because you can't always see it, just because the results are not immediate, doesn't mean that it's not happening. And so what we want to do as leaders is we want to encourage to remember those two things. We want to remind them about why they're here in the first place, number one, and number two, what they're doing is making a difference. So I want to ask you a couple of questions as leaders related to this idea of reminding our volunteers, because we want them to succeed. And this is all related, right? It's all related in the idea that if we want them to win and succeed, then we're going to encourage them and we're going to remind them about what they're doing and why they're there and that makes a difference, because we want them to come back. We want them to feel fired up. We want them to know that they're a part of something that matters. And this is kind of how all looped in together. Because I could do a 10-part webinar series on how to help volunteers succeed and helping volunteers win and all those kinds of things. But for today, I just kind of wanted to focus on a couple of those things, the encouragement and then the reminders. And so to remind them what they're doing is making a difference, I just ask you a couple of questions. So the first one's this: are things so busy that you rarely slow down? Are things so busy that you rarely slow down? Because you're not going to remind your volunteers, and your volunteers are not going to be reminded that they are making a difference unless you take a minute and you step back and you slow down. I know this is cliche and nobody does it, but my nickel's worth of free advice to anyone who's listening to this webinar is you should do it and slow down and take a moment and catch your breath. We understand. I understand. Sunday's always coming. Midweek's always coming. Weekends are always coming. There's another round of curriculum, more rooms to fill. There's more people to plug in. There's new families coming. There's more kids coming. There's more teenagers coming. There's props for the Bible story. There's supplies for your small group activities. There's all the things that go into it. You may have a little anxiety listening to what I just said. I may have a little anxiety listening to what I just said. However, I consider it to be very, very true. So the question is, are things so busy that you actually never slow down? Because if you don't slow down, it's going to be hard to actually take a minute and to remind yourself or your volunteers that they're actually making a difference. The first thing you got to do is slow down. The first thing you got to do is carve out time to spend time with your volunteers, specifically those key leaders in your ministry, to remind them that they're making a difference. I believe strongly in a coaching structure. That could be another subset of things on volunteering in terms of what we're doing, in terms of some of the podcasting world and those kinds of things. We've talked about that. But one of the things that I would always make a point to do is once a month, I would ask every single person on our coaching team to go out to lunch. And we would have, whether that was individually or in a group setting with a couple of them, and we would just sit down and have a conversation and slow down. And what we would do is we would actually kind of slow down and go, how are things going? Give me the situation report. Let's laugh. Let's talk about the trials. Let's talk about the wins. And let's move forward together. And one of the great ideas that came out of one of these coaching meetings that I would have with my coaches was we decided that we were going to take a minute and we were going to slow down enough that we were going to decide to get our volunteers together every so often. Don't miss this, it's so key, with no agenda. So we had kind of a party for our volunteers. I've talked about this on a number of platforms, including the Volunteer Guy podcast that we launched a number of months ago. If you're not following that, that's a really cool thing to check out. We just talk with leaders and volunteers every single week about volunteering and what that looks like. But when we were talking about this idea of making a difference and helping volunteers see that they're making a difference, one of the things that we found out that we could do was just pour into them and invest in them. That led us to create an event with no agenda. It was kind of just like one big party. And it was so funny to watch the volunteers come in because everybody was like, okay, when's the meeting start? When are we going to go through the handbook? And we're like, we're not. We're just hanging out. And people were almost taken back to a point where they did not know what to do with it. So the question is this: are things so busy that you haven't taken a second and slowed down and thought about how you could let your volunteers know consistently that they are actually making a difference in the lives of the people that they serve? Because I'll tell you this, if things are consistently so busy, then they are never going, you're never going to help them understand that they're making a difference if you're just running the constant rat race, the constant hamster wheel of life in terms of staffing and in terms of making this happen. That's the first question under the idea of what they're doing making a difference. The second one is this. It's a really cool one. Do you tell stories? Do you tell stories? Because I'll tell you, a lot of people don't. One of the things that I love to do is tell stories of other volunteers. When you've seen a story, when you've heard a story, when you've experienced a story, we would do everything we could to tell that story to the volunteers at large. Because as we talk about the idea that you can't always see it, we talk about the idea that just because you can't always see it doesn't mean it's not happening. It's the idea that even though one volunteer may not be able to see it, doesn't mean that another volunteer hasn't experienced it. So we would take an opportunity to tell these stories, whether it was on social media or we bring in a video crew and we just sit down and do an interview with the volunteer who had a story to tell about life change or about moving in a different direction in terms of volunteering. There was so many stories we told. Stories over time offer perspective, right? Stories over time offer perspective into someone else's journey, into someone else's world. And so I just believe that if you want to help volunteers be encouraged, right, and be reminded that what they're doing is making a difference, that you got to tell some stories every now and then. That every so often you got to get around the table and figure out how can we communicate a win? How can we communicate a win to the rest of the team that even though that they may not be experiencing something or they may have had a discouraging week, that lo and behold, it can happen and it will happen and it does happen. So what does that look like? Do you tell stories? And the last thing is this. So the question, are things so busy that you rarely slow down? Number 2, do you tell stories? And number 3, do you ever celebrate what you do? Do you ever take a second and celebrate what you do? And I'm not just talking here's the deal, gang. It's so easy to just get your volunteers together, right? I'm talking about, do you ever stop and celebrate what you do? Do you review your year? Do you get everybody around the table and have a conversation or have a dialogue about how the year went? And man, can you believe this person experienced life change and that person experienced life change? And so much of the inspirational things behind that, I think the reason my heart breaks for this issue is because it's rarely shared. And in the leaders and organizations that I've seen or I've consulted with or I've leaned into over the course of time, it's just been one of those ideas or things that has been rarely shared. And so if you want to help volunteers be reminded that they're making a difference, you got to celebrate the wins. You got to get everybody together every now and then and have one big old party and talk about what God's done. Because he's moved in miraculous ways. The question is, has he moved in a way, because you've seen it, that has allowed you to not only tell stories, but recognize it and celebrate it with the rest of the team? Because those are good, amazing things and those need to happen. And what happens is when you celebrate is the celebrating is contagious. The celebrating allows the volunteers to take that back as they go in for another week or another year or another month, whatever that looks like. And the celebrating allows them to slow down and understand that, wow, what I'm doing and what I'm a part of, even though it may not be directly related to me and me personally, It may be one of those things that when they see that the team is winning, they understand that they win. When's the last time you've gotten your volunteers together to celebrate? When's the last time your volunteers have gotten together and actually had one big old party celebrating what God has done through their and their teammates' efforts throughout the last little bit? One of the things I love as I talk about helping volunteers succeed is and again, we could sit here and have a conversation for an hour and a half, but I've told I only have about 20, 25 minutes because I'm to keep this short. It's the idea that volunteers would need two things. They would need to be encouraged and they would need to be reminded, right? They would need encouragement and that they would need reminders. And I think the encouragement speaks for itself, that they need to know that what they're doing and when they show up matters. And then they need to be reminded that why they're there in the first place and why they're making a difference. Because I'll leave you with this thought. You've probably experienced this. You've probably lived here. You've probably dealt with this. It's the idea that God is working through the hard weeks, through the long weeks, through the good weeks, through the bad weeks, through the ups and through the downs. And always volunteers, when they come back, always kind of echo the same thing. Is that, Adam, I'm having trouble seeing it. I keep giving my time. I keep giving my time. And you can't always see it. In fact, you might be able to rarely see it. But just because you can't always see it, it doesn't mean that it's not happening. Some of those very minor tweaks and very minor pieces of encouragement and reminders consistently built into a schedule surrounding your year might actually help volunteers succeed in a little bit of a different way.